At 06:30 on December 17, 1944, Sergeant Jose Mendoza Lopez crouched behind his Browning machine gun on the right flank of Company K, watching German muzzle flashes erupt through the fog, 200 yards east of Krinkelt, Belgium. 33 years old, 6 months of combat, every other machine gun team in the company already dead or wounded. The 12th SS Panzer Division had sent 300 infantry and at least 4 Tiger tanks crashing through the forest toward the American positions. Lopez had been awake for 18 hours. The ground beneath him was frozen solid. Fog hung so thick in the Krinkelwald that he could barely see the treeline where German Panzergrenadiers were massing for another assault. His Browning M1919 weighed 31 liters. The tripod added another 14. Ammunition belts draped across his shoulders added 20 more. 65 lbs of equipment that normally required a 5-man crew to move and operate effectively. Lopez was alone. Company K had arrived at Krinkelt 3 days earlier as part of the 2nd Infantry Division's defense of the Elsenborn Ridge. The division had been fighting since June 7th at Normandy, where Lopez took a German bullet that ricocheted off his ammunition belt. He refused evacuation. 6 months later, he'd watched dozens of friends die in the French hedgerows and Belgian forests. The 2nd Division knew how to fight, but nobody had expected what hit them. On December 16th, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, 200,000 German troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, the entire 6th Panzer Army driving toward the Meuse River with orders to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies in half. The attack caught American forces completely by surprise. Green units crumbled. Even experienced divisions struggled to hold their positions. The 2nd Division stood directly in the path of the SS Panzer Corps' main thrust. Company K sector covered a 4-mile of frozen forest east of Krinkelt. 2 rifle platoon, 1 weapons platoon, maybe 80 men total. German intelligence had identified this exact position as a weak point in the American line. Breakthrough here and the road to Elsenborn Ridge lay wide open. The company had lost 23 men in the first 12 hours. 11 were machine gunners. The Germans had learned to target the crew-served weapons first, take out the Brownings, and the American defensive line collapsed into isolated rifle squads that could be overwhelmed by concentrated infantry assault supported by armor. Lopez had volunteered for the weapons platoon back at Camp Roberts in California. He was 5'5" and weighed 130 lb. Training sergeants told him he was too small to handle a .30 caliber machine gun effectively. He proved them wrong. At Normandy, he'd kept his gun firing while his assistant gunner bled out beside him. In the Siegfried Line, he'd carried the weapon 3 miles through German artillery to reach a new defensive position. The gun never jammed. Lopez never quit. But December 17th was different. The German assault began at 05:30 with a 90-minute artillery barrage. Shells walked through the American positions in methodical patterns designed to destroy foxholes and break communication lines. When the barrage lifted, SS Panzergrenadiers advanced through the fog with Tiger tanks providing direct fire support. The German tactics were flawless. Overwhelming force applied at the weakest point in the defensive line. Company K's left flank started to buckle at 0615. Lopez heard it before he saw it. The distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles mixing with the slower thump of American M1s, screaming, "German! American!" Impossible to tell which was which through the fog and snow. Then he heard the sound that made every infantryman's blood freeze. Tank treads. Multiple vehicles moving fast. The left flank was collapsing. German infantry were pouring through the gap. If they broke through completely, Company K would be surrounded and destroyed. The road to Krinkelt would be open. The entire 2nd Division defensive line would be compromised. If you want to see how Lopez's one-man decision changed the battle, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Lopez. Lopez looked at his Browning, then at the left flank, 400 yards away, across open ground. Company K's commander had positioned him on the right flank, specifically because that's where German reconnaissance had been most active. Moving would leave the right flank exposed, but the left flank was already dying, and Lopez was the only machine gunner still alive. Lopez grabbed the Browning's carrying handle and yanked it off the tripod mount. The barrel was still hot from test firing earlier that morning. He slung 2 ammunition belts across his chest, grabbed the tripod with his other hand, and started running toward the sound of German voices. 400 yards of open ground, snow 18 in deep, fog so thick he could barely see 30 ft ahead. Every step exposed him to German observation. If enemy snipers spotted him crossing that gap, he'd be dead before he made it halfway. He ran anyway. The Browning slammed against his hip with each step. The tripod caught on frozen brush. Ammunition belts swung and tangled around his shoulders. His boots punched through the snow crust into softer powder underneath, making every stride an exhausting fight for balance. Lopez had carried this gun before. Never this far, never this fast, never alone. Behind him, the right flank sat exposed and unmanned. Ahead, German infantry were methodically destroying what remained of Company K's defensive line. Lopez reached a small depression 50 yards behind the left flank positions at 0642. He dropped into the shallow hole and immediately started setting up the Browning tripod first. Unfold the legs, lock them into position, mount the gun, feed the belt, charge the weapon. The entire process normally took 3 men 90 seconds working together. Lopez did it alone in under 2 minutes. The hole offered almost no protection. Everything from his waist up remained exposed to enemy fire, but the position gave him a clear field of fire across the approaches to Company K's left flank. He could see German infantry advancing in squad-sized elements through the trees. Behind them, dark shapes moved through the fog. Armor. Lopez pressed his shoulder against the Browning stock and aimed at a group of 10 SS Panzer Grenadiers who were setting up a base of fire position near a cluster of shattered pine trees. They hadn't seen him yet. They were focused on the American riflemen pinned down in foxholes 40 yards ahead. He squeezed the trigger. The Browning fired at 500 rounds per minute. 17 bursts in 12 seconds. All 10 Germans went down. The survivors in Company K's forward positions heard the gun and immediately understood what it meant. Their machine gunner had found a new firing position. They weren't surrounded. Not yet. But Lopez's muzzle flash had given away his location. German infantry immediately began maneuvering to flank his position. Worse, one of the Tiger tanks turned its attention toward the source of the American machine gun fire. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons and mounted an 88mm main gun that could destroy any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 WLTD against infantry in a shallow foxhole. It was essentially a mobile artillery piece. The tank's commander had seen Lopez's position. Now he was bringing that 88 to bear. Lopez ignored the tank. He had no weapons that could damage it. All he could do was continue engaging the infantry that supported it. Without infantry protection, tanks were vulnerable to bazooka teams and sticky grenades. If Lopez could kill enough German foot soldiers, maybe the tank would pull back. He traversed the gun right and caught a group of 25 SS Panzer Grenadiers attempting to work around his flank. They were moving fast through the trees, using fire and maneuver tactics to close the distance. Lopez fired 3 sustained bursts. The lead elements went down. The rest scattered for cover. Company K's riflemen used the opportunity to shift their positions and consolidate their defensive line. Dead space that had been compromised 10 minutes earlier was now covered by interlocking fields of fire again. The German advance slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. Then the Tiger fired. The 80mm shell impacted the ground 6 ft from Lopez's foxhole. The concussion wave lifted him completely off his feet and threw him backward into the snow. His ears rang. Blood ran from his nose. He couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from inside his skull. Lopez rolled onto his stomach and looked toward his firing position. The Browning lay on its side, next to the overturned tripod. Ammunition belt partially torn. Snow and frozen dirt covered the receiver. German infantry were already advancing toward the unmanned gun position. They thought he was dead. They thought the machine gun was out of action. They thought the left flank was open again. Lopez crawled back toward the Browning through 18 in of snow, grabbed the gun, and started running. Lopez stumbled 30 yards to the right rear before his hearing started to return. The ringing in his ears gradually resolved into the crack of rifle fire and the diesel rumble of German armor. He dropped behind a fallen oak tree and reset the Browning on its tripod. His hands shook as he cleared snow and dirt from the receiver. The gun had taken the full force of the concussion blast, but the mechanism still looked intact. He cycled the bolt. It moved smoothly. The ammunition belt had torn in 2 places, but enough rounds remained linked together for sustained fire. Lopez repositioned the gun to cover the gap between Company K's center and right positions. From this angle, he could see what the fog had hidden before. German infantry were advancing in company strength. At least 150 SS Panzergrenadiers moving through the forest in disciplined assault formations. 3 more Tigers followed behind them, their commanders standing in open hatches directing fire. The German tactics were textbook. Use overwhelming firepower to suppress American positions, advance infantry under cover of that fire, consolidate gains, repeat. It had worked against the French in 1940. It had worked against the Soviets in 1941 and 42. It was working now against Company K. American casualties were mounting. Lopez could see wounded men being dragged back toward Krinkelt by their squadmates. Foxholes that had held 3 riflemen 30 minutes ago now held 1 or none. The defensive line was coming apart, 1 position at a time. Lopez opened fire on a German squad advancing along a forest trail. 5 men went down in the first burst. The survivors dove for cover, but more infantry kept coming. The Germans had numbers and momentum. Company K had neither. A Tiger tank swung its turret toward Lopez's new position. He recognized the movement pattern. The commander had spotted his muzzle flash and was preparing to engage. Lopez had maybe 15 seconds before that 88mm gun fired again. He grabbed the Browning and ran. The shell impacted exactly where he'd been positioned 3 seconds earlier. The explosion shattered the fallen oak and sent splinters spinning through the air like shrapnel. One piece caught Lopez across the left shoulder, tearing through his field jacket, but not penetrating deep enough to disable him. He kept moving. 50 yards farther right, another shallow depression. Lopez dropped into it and set up the Browning for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. His shoulders ached from carrying the gun. His lungs burned from running through deep snow at altitude. He'd been operating on adrenaline and terror for so long that he'd lost track of time. Minutes blurred together. Seconds stretched into hours. But the Browning still worked, and German infantry were still advancing. Lopez engaged targets as they appeared through the fog. A Panzer Grenadier team setting up a mortar position eliminated. A squad attempting to flank Company K's remaining positions destroyed. Individual soldiers running between trees cut down. The gun fired until the barrel glowed red and ammunition smoke obscured his field of vision. Company K survivors began to understand what was happening. Their machine gunner wasn't dead. He was moving. Every time German pressure built against one section of the line, the Browning would suddenly open fire from an unexpected angle. The Germans couldn't predict where Lopez would appear next. They couldn't suppress a position that kept changing. But Lopez could see what Company K's riflemen couldn't. While he fought on the left and center, German infantry had worked around the extreme right flank. At least 40 SS Panzer Grenadiers were moving through heavy forest toward Krinkelt itself. If they reached the village, they could attack Company K from behind. The entire defensive position would collapse. Lopez looked at his ammunition supply. 3 belts remaining, maybe 750 rounds total. He'd already fired more than 500 rounds in less than 30 minutes. The Browning's barrel was dangerously overheated. Army doctrine called for barrel changes after sustained fire to prevent warping and failure. Lopez had no spare barrel. He had no assistant gunner. He had no support. He had 3 ammunition belts and approximately 40 German infantry about to overrun Company K's rear area. Lopez pulled the Browning off its tripod for the 4th time, slung the gun over his shoulder, grabbed his remaining ammunition, and started running toward the sound of German voices in the forest behind American lines. Everything from his waist up would be exposed. The position would offer no cover, no concealment, no support, but it was the only position left that mattered. Lopez reached the rear position at 0705. He'd covered 200 YD in 4 minutes while carrying 65 lbs of equipment through snow that reached above his knees in places. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat soaked through his uniform despite the freezing temperature. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. He set up the Browning anyway. The position he'd chosen was a natural bowl in the terrain, approximately 75 YD, behind Company K's forward foxholes. It offered clear fields of fire toward the German infiltration route, but zero protection. The ground sloped upward in front of him and downward behind. Any soldier standing in this position would be silhouetted against the snow, visible from 3 sides, exposed to fire from multiple angles. Lopez mounted the gun on its tripod and fed in a fresh ammunition belt. His hands moved automatically through the sequence he'd performed thousands of times in training and combat. Lock the belt, chamber around, disengage the safety, shoulder the stock, acquire targets. The German infantry appeared through the fog like ghosts. They were moving in a loose formation designed for speed rather than security. Their officers had clearly assessed the American defensive line as broken and demoralized. They expected minimal resistance during their flanking movement. They expected scared riflemen abandoning positions. They expected chaos. They did not expect a machine gun. Lopez opened fire at 70 yards range. The first burst caught a Panzergrenadier squad leader in mid-stride. The man went down and his team scattered. Lopez traversed left and engaged the second group. 3 men dropped. The survivors dove behind trees. Lopez kept firing. The Browning sustained rate of fire was 500 rounds per minute in short bursts designed to preserve the barrel and conserve ammunition. Lopez ignored doctrine and held the trigger down for sustained bursts of 8 to 12 seconds. The barrel temperature climbed past operational limits. The receiver housing grew hot enough to burn skin. Steam rose from melted snow that splattered against the metal. German infantry tried to locate his position through the fog and gunham smoke. Some fired blindly toward the muzzle flash. Others attempted to maneuver closer. Lopez engaged each group as they revealed themselves. A team setting up a machine gun of their own, destroyed before they could return fire. A rifle squad using a destroyed wagon for cover, eliminated. Individual soldiers trying to reach better firing positions, cut down. The Germans had superior numbers, but Lopez had superior position and firepower. More importantly, he had surprise. The SS Panzer Grenadiers had expected to catch American infantry from behind. Instead, they'd walked into a perfectly positioned machine gun with clear fields of fire, and a gunner who refused to stop shooting. 20 Germans went down in the first 90 seconds. The survivors pulled back into the tree line to reorganize. Lopez used the pause to change ammunition belts. 2 belts remaining. The barrel glowed cherry red. Small parts that should have failed under this level of sustained fire somehow kept functioning. Company K's riflemen heard the Browning firing from their rear and understood immediately what Lopez had done. He'd identified the flanking movement and positioned himself to stop it. Now he was fighting alone against what sounded like an entire German platoon. Several riflemen abandoned their forward positions and started moving back to support him. Their squad leaders ordered them to hold position. The forward line couldn't be abandoned, or the entire defensive situation would collapse. Lopez would have to handle the flanking force alone. The Germans reorganized faster than Lopez expected. Their officer had assessed the situation correctly. One American machine gun, isolated position, limited ammunition. The obvious tactical response was to fix Lopez in place with suppressing fire, while assault elements maneuvered to eliminate him. 30 SS Panzer Grenadiers opened fire simultaneously from 3 different positions. Rifle rounds snapped past Lopez's head. Bullets impacted the ground around his foxhole. Dirt and snow exploded into the air. The volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Lopez couldn't return fire without exposing himself to multiple German shooters. He couldn't relocate without abandoning the position. He couldn't retreat without leaving Company K's rear completely exposed. While the suppressing fire pinned him down, 15 German infantry started a coordinated assault from 2 angles. They were moving fast, professional, disciplined. Lopez had 90 seconds before they overran his position. He had 1 ammunition belt left, and he was completely alone. Lopez waited until the German assault elements closed to 40 yards. At that range, their supporting fire had to cease or risk hitting their own men. The suppressing fire slackened. German voices shouted commands in the fog. The assault teams prepared for their final rush. Lopez raised the Browning and fired. The first burst caught the right-side assault element head-on. 5 SS Panzer Grenadiers went down before they could react. Lopez traversed left without lifting his finger from the trigger. The sustained burst walked across the left-side assault team. 4 more Germans dropped. The survivors threw themselves behind any cover they could find, but Lopez's sustained fire had consequences. The Browning's barrel was operating far beyond safe temperature limits. The metal had expanded from heat stress. The receiver housing glowed visibly even in daylight. Small components that should have seized or warped somehow continued functioning, but Lopez could feel the weapon's performance degrading. The bolt cycled slower, extraction became sluggish, failures were imminent. He kept firing anyway. The Germans, who'd been providing suppressing fire, now faced a choice. Continue pinning Lopez down while their assault teams bled out in the open, or shift fire to support the survivors. They chose support. 30 rifles opened up simultaneously, trying to cover the German infantry as they pulled back to better positions. Lopez engaged targets faster than the Germans could identify his muzzle flash and return accurate fire. A Panzer Grenadier, attempting to drag a wounded comrade to safety, cut down. A machine gun team trying to set up a base of fire position, destroyed before they could chamber their first round. An officer rallying his troops behind a snow-covered embankment, eliminated. The last ammunition belt ran dry at 0712. Lopez had fired approximately 2,000 rounds in 37 minutes. He'd moved positions 4 times while carrying equipment that normally required a 5-man crew. He'd engaged German forces from 4 different angles, creating the illusion of multiple American machine gun teams operating in coordinated defense. The SS Panzer Grenadier still didn't know they'd been fighting 1 man. Company K's defensive line still held barely. Lopez pulled the smoking Browning off its tripod and looked toward Krinkelt. American wounded were being evacuated through the village. Supply trucks were burning. Medics worked in the open under German artillery fire. The 2nd Infantry Division was conducting a fighting withdrawal under impossible circumstances, but they were still organized, still functional, still in the fight, because 1 machine gunner had bought them 37 minutes. But Lopez's ammunition was gone. The Browning was overheated to the point of mechanical failure, and the German assault wasn't stopping. It was intensifying. Through the fog, Lopez could see fresh German infantry moving up to replace the casualties he'd inflicted. These weren't disorganized survivors. These were reinforcements. At least 60 SS Panzer Grenadiers advancing in proper assault formation with armor support. 2 Tiger tanks were maneuvering into position to provide direct fire against what remained of Company K's foxholes. American artillery tried to interdict the German advance, but the fog made accurate fire impossible. Shells impacted randomly through the forest. Some fell among German positions. Others landed dangerously close to American lines. The artillery forward observers couldn't see their targets. They were firing blind, hoping to slow the enemy advance through sheer volume of high explosive. It wasn't working. Lopez could hear American squad leaders shouting orders to fall back. Company K had held this position for over an hour against overwhelming German pressure. They'd inflicted significant casualties. They'd disrupted the SS Panzer Corps' timetable. But the tactical situation was untenable. German infantry were infiltrating through gaps in the line. Tigers were bringing their main guns to bear. American ammunition was running critically low. The order came at 07:20. Company K would withdraw to secondary positions closer to Krinkelt. They would conduct a fighting retreat, maintaining contact with German forces while pulling back an echelon. It was a dangerous maneuver that required discipline and courage. Lopez stood in his foxhole holding an empty machine gun and watched American riflemen start pulling back under fire. They moved in pairs, one man covering while his partner displaced. Professional, controlled, but slow, too slow. German infantry saw the withdrawal beginning and immediately pressed their attack. They knew this was the moment of maximum vulnerability. If they could break the American withdrawal into a rout, Company K would be destroyed. Lopez looked at his Browning, empty, overheated, probably damaged beyond field repair, useless. Then he looked at the German infantry advancing toward Company K's retreating riflemen, and he picked up the gun anyway. Lopez ran toward the position where Company K's weapons platoon had been overrun during the initial German assault. That's where the other machine gun teams had died. That's where their ammunition might still be. He reached the destroyed foxholes at 07:23. 3 dead American gunners lay where they'd fallen. German infantry had already stripped them of personal items, but hadn't bothered with the bulky ammunition boxes. Lopez found 2 metal containers half buried in snow. Each held a 250-round belt for the Browning, 500 rounds total, enough for maybe 6 minutes of sustained fire at combat rates. Lopez grabbed both boxes and started back toward a position that could cover Company K's withdrawal route. His shoulders burned, his back screamed. He'd been carrying the Browning and its associated equipment for over 40 minutes through combat conditions. Most machine gun crews rotated, carrying duties among multiple men precisely because the physical demands were unsustainable for extended periods. Lopez had no crew to rotate with. He found a position behind a destroyed farm cart 30 yards from Company K's withdrawal axis. The cart's wooden sides had been shredded by German machine gun fire, but the metal wheel hubs provided minimal cover. Lopez set up the Browning, loaded a fresh belt, and waited. Company K's riflemen were executing their withdrawal under intense German pressure. They moved in fire teams, 3 men providing covering fire while 2 displaced backward. Then the roles reversed. It was textbook small unit tactics performed under the worst possible conditions. Fog, snow, overwhelming enemy forces, casualties mounting with each bound backward. German infantry pressed hard. They could see the Americans retreating. They knew that if they maintained contact and kept pressure on the withdrawal, Company K would eventually break. Individual soldiers would panic. Unit cohesion would collapse. An organized retreat would become a rout. The SS Panzer Grenadiers had done this before. France 1940, Poland 1939. They knew how to exploit a retreating enemy, apply constant pressure, never allow reorganization, pursue until complete destruction. Lopez opened fire at 80 yards range. A German squad that had been preparing to rush an isolated group of American riflemen went down. The survivors scattered. Company K's isolated team used the opportunity to fall back to their next position. Lopez traversed right and engaged another German element. 5 SS Panzer Grenadiers attempting to work around Company K's flank. 3 dropped. The others dove for cover. The American withdrawal continued. For 6 minutes, Lopez provided covering fire from a position the Germans couldn't locate through the fog and smoke. He fired short bursts to conserve ammunition. He shifted his point of aim constantly to create the illusion of multiple guns. He engaged targets of opportunity and targets of necessity with equal precision. The Browning function, despite operating conditions that should have caused catastrophic mechanical failure. The overheated barrel should have warped. The bolt should have seized. The receiver should have cracked from thermal stress. Instead, the gun kept firing. Lopez's last belt ran dry at 0731. He'd bought Company K another 8 minutes. American riflemen had used that time to establish a new defensive line, 200 Y, closer to Krinkelt. They'd recovered their wounded. They'd maintained unit integrity. The withdrawal hadn't collapsed into panic, but Lopez was out of ammunition again, and German infantry were closing on his position. He could see SS Panzer Grenadiers maneuvering through the trees, at least 20 soldiers moving in proper fire and maneuver formation. They'd identified his general location from muzzle flash. Now they were conducting a coordinated assault to eliminate the machine gun that had been disrupting their advance for the past hour. Lopez pulled the Browning off its tripod. The barrel was so hot it had scorched the woodstock. The metal receiver housing could no longer be touched with bare hands. Small parts rattled inside the mechanism in ways that indicated imminent mechanical failure. But Company K needed covering fire for another 200 wildfires. They needed someone to slow the German pursuit just long enough for defensive positions to be consolidated. They needed a machine gunner. Lopez was the only machine gunner left alive. He looked at the destroyed farm cart, then at the German infantry advancing through the fog, then at Company K's riflemen struggling to maintain their withdrawal under fire. The tactical situation was simple. Lopez could abandon his position, retreat to Krinkelt, and survive. Or he could stay and provide covering fire with a broken gun and no ammunition while German infantry surrounded him. Company K's wounded needed 5 more minutes to reach safety. 5 minutes before, German Tigers could bring direct fire onto the new defensive line. 5 minutes before the withdrawal became a massacre, Lopez stayed. Lopez crouched behind the destroyed farm cart with an empty machine gun and waited for the German infantry to close within killing range. He had no ammunition, no support, no realistic chance of survival, but he had the Browning's profile, and he had German caution. The SS Panzer Grenadiers, advancing toward his position, had watched their comrades get cut down by accurate machine gun fire for the past hour. They'd seen entire squads destroyed by sustained bursts from what appeared to be multiple American gun positions. They'd learned to respect the American machine gunners. They'd learned to approach carefully. Lopez used that caution against them. He repositioned the Browning to face the German advance. He adjusted the tripod. He made a show of feeding an ammunition belt into the receiver. Even though the belt was empty, he moved deliberately, visibly. He wanted the Germans to see him preparing to fire. The German assault slowed. Squad leaders shouted orders to take cover. Soldiers dove behind trees and snowdrifts. An officer called for suppressing fire. 30 rifles opened up on Lopez's position. Bullets snapped past his head. Rounds impacted the farm cart. Wood splinters exploded into the air. Lopez stayed low and let them shoot. Every second the Germans spent suppressing his position was another second Company K's wounded moved closer to safety. Every rifle round fired at him was one less round fired at retreating American infantry. The suppressing fire continued for 90 seconds. Then it stopped. German squad leaders needed to assess the situation. Had they killed the machine gunner? Was the position destroyed? Could they advance? Lopez raised his head above the farm cart, just high enough to be visible. Then he ducked back down. The Germans opened fire again. Another 90 seconds of sustained rifle fire. Hundreds of rounds expended against a single immobile target. The farm cart disintegrated under the volume of incoming fire. Pieces of wood and metal scattered across the snow. Lopez stayed down and counted seconds. Company K needed 3 more minutes. Behind him, he could hear American voices organizing the new defensive line. Sergeants positioning riflemen, officers calling for ammunition redistribution, medics treating wounded, the sounds of a military unit that remained functional despite catastrophic pressure. The German fire slackened again. This time, SS Panzergrenadiers started advancing in bounds, while others provided covering fire. They were moving carefully, professionally. They expected the American machine gunner to open fire at any moment. Lopez waited until they closed to 50 yards. Then he stood up behind the destroyed farm cart and pointed the empty Browning directly at the advancing Germans. The German assault froze. Soldiers dove for cover. Officers screamed orders. For 5 critical seconds, the entire German advance halted because 30 SS Panzergrenadiers believed they were about to receive machine gun fire. Lopez dropped back behind the cart. The Germans opened fire again, but those 5 seconds had given Company K's last wounded team time to reach the new defensive line. The withdrawal was complete. American artillery forward observers finally got accurate coordinates on the German positions. Heavy shells began impacting through the forest where SS Panzergrenadiers had concentrated for their assault. The barrage wasn't designed to destroy German forces. It was designed to cover Company K's withdrawal and convince German commanders that continued pursuit would be too costly. It worked. The German advance halted at 0742. Their officers assessed the tactical situation and determined that American defenses around Krinkelt were too strong for immediate assault. The SS Panzer Corps would consolidate gains, reorganize, and attack again after proper artillery preparation. Company K had held for 1 hour and 12 minutes against overwhelming German force. They'd inflicted significant casualties. They disrupted the enemy timetable. They'd bought time for the 2nd Infantry Division to establish defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge that would stop the entire northern shoulder of Hitler's offensive. American riflemen from Company K found Lopez at Aero 815, still crouched behind the destroyed farm cart with his empty Browning. He'd been pinned down by German fire for 33 minutes after running out of ammunition. His uniform was shredded by splinters. His face was covered in dirt and powder residue. His hands shook from exhaustion, but he was alive, and so was Company K. The company commander personally ordered Lopez evacuated to Krinkelt for medical evaluation. Lopez refused. His weapon needed ammunition. His position needed to be maintained. The Germans would attack again. It took a direct order from a captain to get Lopez to abandon his machine gun and move to the rear. Even then, he insisted on carrying the Browning himself. The gun had saved his life for 6 months of combat. He wasn't leaving it in a foxhole. Company K held Krinkelt for another 18 hours before withdrawing to final positions on Elsenborn Ridge. The 2nd Infantry Division stopped the 6th SS Panzer Army cold. The northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge became an American defensive victory that changed the entire course of Hitler's last offensive. And it started with one sergeant who refused to let his machine gun go silent. The official citation came through 6 months later. Sergeant Jose Mendoza Lopez, Weapons Platoon, Company M, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, Medal of Honor for actions near Krinkelt, Belgium on December 17, 1944. The citation documented what Lopez had done in clinical military language. Repositioned heavy machine gun 4 times under direct enemy fire. Killed at least 100 German soldiers. Held defensive positions alone against overwhelming enemy force. Enabled Company K to withdraw successfully and avoid encirclement. What the citation didn't capture was the physical impossibility of what Lopez accomplished. One man carrying equipment designed for 5, fighting for over an hour against company strength, German assault supported by Tiger tanks. Moving positions while under direct fire, continuing to fight after running out of ammunition, surviving artillery strikes that should have killed him. Major General James Van Fleet presented the Medal of Honor to Lopez on June 18, 1945, in Nuremberg, Germany. The ceremony took place in a city that had been the symbolic heart of Nazi power. Now, American soldiers stood in the rubble and honored a Mexican-born sergeant who'd helped destroy Hitler's last offensive. Lopez's fellow soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division attended the ceremony. They'd fought from Normandy to the Ila River. They'd seen countless acts of courage under fire. But what Lopez did at Krinkelt stood apart. One machine gunner against an SS Panzer Division, and the machine gunner won. The 2nd Infantry Division's defense of Ellenbourne Ridge became one of the decisive actions of the Battle of the Bulge. While the 101st Airborne held Bastogne in the south and earned headlines, the 2nd Division stopped the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north and broke Hitler's entire offensive plan. The German timetable called for Ellenbourne Ridge to fall in 12 hours. It never fell. Lopez's actions on December 17th bought the critical time needed to establish that defense. Company K held when it should have collapsed. The withdrawal succeeded when it should have become a rout. American forces consolidated on Elsenborn Ridge instead of being overrun in scattered positions through the forest. The strategic consequences extended far beyond one Belgian village. The 6th SS Panzer Army represented Germany's best remaining armored forces in the West. Hitler had committed them to a desperate offensive designed to split Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The failure at Elsenborn Ridge meant the failure of that entire strategy. German forces never reached the Meuse River. They never threatened Antwerp. They never split the Allied advance. Instead, they bled themselves white against American defensive positions and accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. Germany surrendered 4 months later. Lopez returned to Brownsville, Texas after the war. He worked for the Veterans Administration. He remained deeply religious and credited the Virgin of Guadalupe with his survival. The Mexican government awarded him their highest military honors. Streets and schools were named after him. But Lopez never sought attention. He'd done his duty. That was enough. He re-enlisted in 1949 and fought in Korea until a superior officer discovered that a Medal of Honor recipient was serving in combat and ordered him to the rear. Lopez retired as a master sergeant in 1973 after 31 years of service. He died on May 16, 2005, at age 94. His wife Amelia, who he married in 1942, had died 1 year earlier. Jose Mendoza Lopez's story represents something fundamental about the Second World War. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to individual soldiers making impossible choices. Lopez could have stayed on the right flank where he'd been positioned. He could have retreated when the ammunition ran out. He could have survived by doing the tactically sensible thing. Instead, he picked up a machine gun that weighed almost half what he did and fought an entire SS Panzer Division to a standstill. One man, one weapon, 1 hour that changed the course of a battle, that changed the course of a war. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who saved lives with machine guns and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jose Mendoza Lopez doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that